What happens when a well-published print author and successful bookseller decides to change course completely and become an evangelist for a digital publishing future? You're going to find out today on this episode of Disruptor.
From the edges of publishing, it's Disruptor, celebrating the rebels, mavericks, and weirdos of the publishing industry and encouraging each of you to disrupt in your own way. Now here's your host, John Bard.
Greetings, one and all. Welcome to Disruptor, Episode 5, with author and digital evangelist Mark Leslie. I'm John Bard. I've been in the publishing world for close to 30 years, and I've seen a lot of things change, but maybe they haven't changed fast enough. And so I asked the question, are there disruptors out there? Are there people and companies that are really changing things in publishing, pushing us into the future, throwing out the old rule book and creating a new one all their own? I went in search of that, and I found them. And every week here on Disruptor, you'll meet them. Welcome to the journey. It's time to disrupt. Today's episode of Disruptor is brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book. Mark Leslie's path to becoming a digital publishing evangelist began in the most analog way imaginable. He started writing as a teenager on an old Underwood typewriter he found buried deep in his mother's closet. Since then, he's gone on to become a very successful author with more than a dozen full-length books to his name. He also caught the book-selling bug and started working in shops large and small. For a man with such an extensive print background, it must have been a surprise to many when in 2011 he became the director of self-publishing at Kobo, one of the earliest and most powerful forces in digital publishing. Mark now travels the world talking about advances in digital publishing and the vast, incredible opportunities that exist for writers and publishers. I spoke to Mark from his home in Southern Ontario. Well, welcome, Mark Leslie, to Disruptor. It's really great to have you here. The first thing that we do with our guests is ask a simple question. We are celebrating the rebels, the mavericks, and the weirdos of the publishing world. Which one of those words best describes you?
Oh, geez. When you left on weirdo, I think I'm one of the weirdos of publishing, maybe because even though I've been corporate and I've worn a corporate hat for a long, long time, I've always done things my own way. And I've always had a DIY approach to publishing. Even my traditional publishing, a lot of my early traditional publishing was very DIY. So a little bit of maverick and a little bit of weirdo. Can I be a hybrid?
Sure. That's what being a maverick's all about. Right?
But thanks for having me here. It's great to be on the show. I love what you're doing, and I love the approach that you're taking, and how you're looking at publishing in this brilliant and interesting perspective.
Well, thank you. So let's follow up on that. Is there enough innovation happening in publishing right now?
There can never be too much innovation. But yeah, you know what? I think there's a lot of innovation happening, and I think what happens, and this particularly happens for someone like myself who, I remember 10 years ago almost getting so excited about the advances with print on demand and the espresso book machine, for example, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which, I'd owned one of those machines back in 2009 in Hamilton, Ontario, and it was, I think, the 7th or 9th in the world or something like that. And I fully believe that by now there would be hundreds and hundreds of them around the world. I still think that there's disruptions that have been introduced, and there's been technologies and advances and innovations that have been introduced that haven't yet fully been adopted in a way that they could be. And even, we're starting to see audiobooks now. I've been excited about audiobooks for a long, long time, and it feels like I'm getting impatient, and it feels like, things should have changed by now. But you've got to remember, one of the biggest innovations in the publishing industry lately was ebooks. But as I like to say, life doesn't begin till 40, because the ebook didn't really take off after very many failed or aborted attempts until the ebook was about 40 years old. When you actually look at when the very first ebook was published, which you might not consider an ebook because it wasn't an EPUB, a .epub file. You think about in 1999, I remember when Stephen King was experimenting with emailing stories to people, and I was at Chapters Indigo, which was a retailer, and we were selling, for 99 cents, he was selling a serialized ebook thing that he was doing, but then ebooks didn't take off until the Kindle launched. Really. I mean, Sony had a great reader, and then it was the iPad and the Kindle that really made a huge difference. But that was 40 years after the ebook was introduced. And we're not used to technology taking so long. But look at where we are now with devices like this that, 10 years ago, this was a giant MP3 player. And it wasn't necessarily an iPod because they were too expensive for me, but I got the generic MP3 player. And now, all the podcasts like yours, I'll just be listening to it on my phone on the go without having to have that extra device. So I think there is a lot of innovation happening, and sometimes there's so much innovation happening that we haven't even adopted it properly. And I think that's the big frustration for me, is there's so much good stuff out there that publishers and writers still haven't taken advantage of that has been there. And if I can go back to print on demand is an amazing technology that allows you not to have to ship dead trees back and forth, like into bookstores and back out of bookstores and stuff like that. It allows this opportunity where you can actually create a digital file, which is how mostly all books are created, except for the handcrafted ones. And then you can provide a file, ship the file, and print it locally, as opposed to shipping it in a truck. And again, in 2009, I was doing that at McMaster University Bookstore as a means to save money for students. And again, we still barely tapped into the surface of leveraging that. I mean, publishers like Random House or HarperCollins have tens of thousands of books in their backlist that are not going to be stocked at your local Barnes & Noble in the States or Chapters Indigo in Canada or W.H. Smith. With the technology that does exist, print on demand, having the bookstore be able to just get a book within 15 minutes. You order the book, you download the file, you pay for it digitally, and then you print it, and 15 minutes later, that book is printed in your store. You don't even have to worry about overnight shipping. 10 years ago, I was excited about that technology, and that technology still isn't. We should have vending machines for books everywhere.
Right.
So I think sometimes innovations like ebooks that took 40 years before they really took off, sometimes they take a little bit longer. And I think even though I get impatient, I have to remind myself, maybe I'm just reminding myself now, to be a little bit more patient for the ones that have already been created, because it takes a while for them to take hold sometimes.
Well, in other areas, in other business fields, disruption and innovation could take 4 months instead of 40 years. So it's a very world. And is part of it because of the notion that we've sort of bought into of gatekeeping, that, we celebrate these famous editors from the past who worked with authors and did great work and pulled together great novels from the past. And are we still too attached to that idea that there needs to be somebody to look at a manuscript and say, yes, this manuscript is worth being read and seen by the world?
Yeah, when I think about, because I've had the pleasure of working with so many amazing and talented people in the publishing industry, one of my favorite recent thoughts about editing and what editors and what that curation can do is Harper Lee and To Kill a Mockingbird. Mm-hmm. When Harper Lee submitted her manuscript about the young woman trying to come home, and you can never go home again as an adult because she sees her dad in a different light than she saw him when she was a kid. And then the editor said, you know what, I really want to read this. I really want to read the story of her childhood and how much she worshipped her father. Write that first. Right. And that became To Kill a Mockingbird, which is one of the best books I've ever read. And then I read Ghost of the Watchman, which was the original manuscript that she had submitted. Mm-hmm. And I go, that's a good editor who saw the heart of of an amazing story and pulled that out of a writer. So that was part curation, but part coaching. However, you don't have to, all the decisions of what gets published shouldn't be because some sales rep is going to New York. Some New York publisher is going to sit down with someone else in New York to decide what books are going to get distributed through Barnes & Noble for the year. That shouldn't decide publishing either. What I love about the curation now And it's the old saying that the slush pile has been relegated. And the slush pile is just a derogatory term that's used to denote the reams and reams of manuscript boxes that, fill up publishers' warehouses that some editorial assistant has to go through and say, this is good enough to go to the next level. But the slush pile is now in a catalog near you, and it's the readers who decide. And the readers decide whether or not it's good. And the reason I like that is because with the amalgamation of publishing, when I started in this industry, I think there were 10 big publishers. Now there's 5 big publishers. And what happens is a really, really good book can get passed up because there's only so much space that these publishers can bridge into. But when you start looking at independent publishing and self-published authors, you look at, well, Random House, let's say, for example, isn't going to publish this book because they have a book just like that already in their catalog. And so they only have room for 100 titles this season for that imprint. Therefore, they're going to pass on a really, really good book. Not because it's not a good book, because they can only publish so much, and there's only so much throughput that they can do. But when you allow that to be put out into the community, and you allow the most important person in the equation, the reader, I'd say the writer and the reader, of course, but together, when you allow the reader to decide for themselves what they want to read, it's like, yeah, you know what? I've already read a book like that, and I want to read another book like that, and I want to read another book like that, and I want to read another book like that. When you allow the reader to decide, that's a huge disruption. I mean, that's a huge thing that happened, that it's still curation, but it's open curation. Mm-hmm. It's curation from multiple niche markets, which is way more powerful than somebody trying to decide that, well, you know what, this is going to be the #1 New York Times best-selling book, as opposed to this book, which may only ever sell 500 copies, but it's going to be beloved by the 500 people who find it because they're in this target audience. That is an amazing element of curation, and it happens at the most important level. The proof is in that social proof that somebody's read it, somebody's shared the review on Goodreads or Amazon or on iBooks or Kobo or any of the retailers where they post reviews. And that, to me, is still curation. It's just curation after it's produced, rather than deciding that this is allowed to be out into the world.
So if you're a 20-year-old aspiring author, this makes sense. This idea of self-empowerment, taking control, creating your own sub-niche perhaps, using social media, that makes complete sense. But let's talk about someone who's maybe 45 or 50, and they want to write books, they want to be an author, they want to share their work with the world. Their perception growing up of the publishing world was, you write a query letter, you send it off to somebody in New York, maybe if you're lucky, they say, yes, we want it, and then you sit back and you show up at book signings, right? Yeah. So for someone who's bought into that notion, what you've just described is actually quite terrifying.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's of the sheer level of possibilities and nobody to point at them and say, you're allowed in. What message would you give to somebody like that trying to get the courage to move forward?
Well, the first message, I'm gonna kind of wave a book at you. I mean, right? Guide to manuscript formats. This guide to querying cover letters. I grew up writing on a typewriter. I grew up subscribed to that notion. I grew up in that world, and that was my dream. And I have gone through that world. And as a bookseller myself, I also believed that self-published books were crap. But I had enough experience in the industry over time to realize that there's a lot of good books that weren't getting published. I also realized that there is no such thing as I'm going to write a book, sit back and do nothing but show up at book signings. Mm-hmm. That I actually do more. I have great publicists at Dundurn, one of my publishers, and they do a lot of great stuff with me and for me, and they do some of the bookings, but a lot of it's the groundwork that I have to do myself. You know, they helped book me into a library talk, but it was me that recorded the video to advertise this, to get a full house of people to show up. It's me that's pushing the messages out on social media. Probably the reason I got the contract was because they saw that I was a shameless self-promoter. So what I try to do when I talk to authors, I try to say that there is no one path anymore. There used to be one path, and it was only this. You found an agent or an editor, and you sold it to them, and then hopefully, and you prayed. And then you waited 6 months for your next rejection, and you did it over again, and you did it at least 13 or 14 or 15 times because that's the average submission rejection. Now I look at it, and I like to break it down and say, you have options within traditional publishing, way more than I had when I first started. You have options in self-publishing. There's self-guided, self-directed, where you hire the editor and you hire the cover designer. But then there's also, and you got to be careful, this is where a lot of people get bitten. There are great service providers who actually provide, you know what, I'm going to just get a package, and then I'm gonna upfront put the cost in rather than the publisher. But I'm going to do the same sort of thing. They're going to find an editor. They're going to do all this work for me. That's where the rip-off artists take advantage of writers, unfortunately. But there are also some great opportunities. So even when you self-publish, there's different complete DIYs versus self-directed and other things that you can do.
So what you just described still would sound terrifying to that 45 to 50-year-old author that I'm talking about. So speak to him or her. Give them some advice on how to change their mindset to become a modern author.
Opportunity can be scary, but opportunity can also be very liberating and allow me to explore, reach new readers that I've never been able to reach before. And when you think about, at the end of the day, as a writer, you just want people to read your stuff. Ideally, you get paid for people to read your stuff, but you're really creating a story for that universal human element of connecting to people. And when you take all the scariness aside and you take all the elements aside, those are just things that you learn how to do. You learned how to type. We naturally thought of how to tell stories, and we have imaginations, and we were born with them, and then we learned how to write these things down. And we're not doing scriptive anymore in school, but at least print them, and then we learn how to convey those thoughts on a keyboard. We learned how to read those words off of text. We learned how to read those words off of our Kindles and other electronic devices. We learned how to listen to those stories, so watch them on TV. That's the universal thing that we're trying to do, is connect with other people. And I would just remind people who are frightened of it that I've learned it, other people have learned it, and if you break it down into those little chunks of things that you can learn, you're really just giving yourself a bold new way to create stories that people can enjoy.
So what are the first 3 chunks that somebody can learn if they're viewing this vast landscape of opportunity, but it is foreign to them, they're a little bit tentative about moving forward? Let's just take some baby steps. What are the first 3 things that you might suggest that an aspiring author understand right now?
Okay. Well, I think since a lot of people may not even have ever read an ebook, just to understand the experience, go on a paper-free diet for 10 days and see if you can, either through your library, some libraries have great programs like that. You have a free app. You can download a free Kobo app, a free Kindle app, free, obviously, iBooks app, free Nook app. And you can even get ebooks for free, or you can borrow them from your library, for example, and just try reading digitally. And then once you get used to the concept that it's all about the story and it's the content that's actually the master, I think that understanding that is just a different way of reading, that once you're in the story, I can't even remember, did I read this book in paperback? I didn't read this book in paperback. This is a signed copy. I read it on my Kobo. But this other book I listened to. I think understanding that is the first step. And maybe it's an early baby step, but it really helps you appreciate that it's about the story. The second step is to, just take a look at, there's so many free resources out there. There's so many great podcasts, etc., that kind of walk you through the process. Go and create an account. Go to Kindle Direct Publishing and just create an account and just take a look at it. Go to Smashwords or Draft2Digital, which are aggregators that would distribute to all the retailers. Go to Kobo Writing Life, create an account, and just take a look at it. You don't have to publish anything. You can just go in and take a look and say, oh, okay, this is where you enter the title. This is where you put in the description. This is where you would load the cover, but I don't have one yet. That's okay. But at least you understand what it looks like. And then you can sit back and say, whoa, I understand this. I can do this now. And then I think the third one is potentially, and again, I'm a podcast listener, so I listen to writing podcasts where writers talk about the process and talk about we've all had to overcome our own fears and our own worries. We all had to learn how to edit. We all had to learn how to rewrite. We all had to, I think as a writer, the scariest thing you ever did was show a second person that thing that you wrote. That's way more scary than publishing a book in ebook form. If you can get over showing the story to someone else, you've got it mastered already. You're already halfway there.
What's happening that's disruptive in publishing that adds more opportunity for readers and writers that you see coming that gets you excited?
I've been waiting for augmented reality meets storytelling. I've been waiting for location-based stuff. We saw Pokemon Go explode, but what we didn't see is something that I've been dreaming about for almost half a decade or more, and that is a murder mystery that's built into a location-based app where you actually have to move in physical time and space. Kind of like Pokemon Go takes you to, because my son is he's 13, and for the last several years we've done Pokemon Go when we're in new cities because it's a great way to explore, and you go to local landmarks and you end up learning about some of the history. Imagine combining that location-based app with a murder mystery where you have to track, get the clues, and you only get the clue, or you only reveal that part of the story once you get to the location which you solve. So it's like a choose-your-own-adventure in real time and space that you can adapt through storytelling. So we have all the location-based apps and the check-ins and all that, and we have great storytellers. We haven't put them together yet. I'm looking forward to that. I'm sure it's going to happen. I play an app called Zombies Run, and it's a running app, and I like to run, and you're hearing stories, and you're runner number 5 in a zombie apocalypse, and again, there's all these great stories going on, and there's seasons available, and it draws from your own music playlist, and then it tells the story from these people who are talking to you in your ear. And runner 5, you don't know if runner 5 is a man or a woman. It doesn't matter. It's just whoever you are. And then it builds the location-based app is that when there's random zombie attacks come, you have to run 10% faster for a full minute or else you lose all your supplies. and so it combines this gamification with storytelling with location-based apps in a really unique way. And I still think we're only at the beginning of that. Add in augmented reality and storytelling, and I think there's a whole new opportunity that exists. And I still think that we haven't fully explored the full power and capability of audio. I mean, you have a podcast. People are listening to this most likely while they are doing something else. I read a lot of books while I'm on a run. And I say read because I'm listening to a book, or while I'm driving in the car, or while I'm walking the dog or doing the dishes. And I'm absorbing and enjoying or learning, depending on what it is, through audio, and we haven't even taken full advantage of that yet. So even as I said, there's some technologies we've had that we just haven't leveraged, and I look forward to seeing how those can further create new opportunities for writers and publishers.
Great. Who is a disruptor, either in history or alive today, that you really appreciate and admire?
Well, I mean, I'd have to go back to Gutenberg and how he opened up publishing. But when I think about like a modern Gutenberg, I think about some like a Steve Jobs or a Jeff Bezos, because I mean, really, those technologies really made some significant changes in how we consume media. And I'll use that because I look back at reading the Everything Store about Amazon, and it's funny because in my past I've been an advocate of the independent bookstore fighting against Amazon. And when I was at Kobo, they were the ruthless the evil empire, like from Star Wars, and we were the small rebel alliance trying to just stay alive against them. But I still look at what he did and the innovation of online book selling, for one, and then it wasn't until the launch of really the Kindle that ebooks really became a little bit more commonplace. There's still only 20 to 30% of the market, but I still think that disruption has allowed more writers the ability, I mean, and there's great companies like Kobo and iBooks and Nook, et cetera, that also do the same thing, but it was that initial disruption that proved that this could be a viable thing and that writers could actually leave full-time employment and write full-time. Because advances with publishers, I've got a lot of friends in traditional publishing who were making six-figure advances on their books, and they're not getting six-figure advances anymore. And so they're looking at, well, I still have stories to tell. I may or may not do my next books with traditional publishing. Maybe I'll sell some rights, and I'll do my other rights in a different way. So, yeah, I think modern technology would probably be Jeff Bezos.
That's, it's interesting, and I think it speaks to a good mindset for success as an author or in the publishing world, because not everything's black and white. I mean, you can not appreciate Amazon's business practices and maybe, the way they pay authors or what have you. There are things about it you could not appreciate, but at the same time, look at it and go, my goodness, what an opportunity as a reader and as an author that they've provided. So I think that's a very refreshing take, especially hearing out, because when you started saying that, I was like, wait a minute, this guy was a bookseller. Skyline Bookstore. That
No,
was
I was in Ottawa fighting against Amazon lawyers that were shipped up from, and they, their room full of really expensive, high-paid lawyers against little old me. Guess who won all the time? I mean, it was David versus Goliath. I hated them.
Yeah.
But I also have to respect what they've done, and I have to respect that they always put the customer first, and they've done a really, really good job of that. So there's companies that still do a really, really good job and have still created opportunities, even though I don't necessarily. Yeah, it is. There is no black and white. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gray, but it doesn't mean that a bad business practice can't have turned into something good. But I'm always the kind of guy who wants to make lemonade out of those lemons. So I'll always look for the opportunities that exist, even when it's crushing. So that's just sort of that's part of my take on life, I think.
Right. So all sorts of folks are listening. We have authors, aspiring writers, people who want to start publishing companies, perhaps people who want to develop technology. There are people who have a real hunger to disrupt. They wouldn't be listening to this podcast if they didn't. What advice can you give them to kind of take that step over the Rubicon, to go from saying, I wish I could do this, or I'd love to do this, to actually doing it?
Well, because I'm a Canadian, I'm gonna quote a Canadian, and I believe it was Wayne Gretzky who said, "You miss 100% of the shots you never take." And on my own podcast, I'd interviewed a musician who gives away a lot of his music for free. And he says 100% of the people who never hear your stuff have no opportunity to like your stuff. So you have to take a risk. You have to stick your neck out. You're going to get hurt. You're not always going to succeed. I fail 10 times more often than I succeed, but I just keep trying. And I think a lot of I've read the Steve Jobs biography, the Jeff Bezos, the Bruce Springsteen and the Phil Collins, and I saw how these people who've created and achieved all these things, you think about where George Lucas was when he had this idea for Star Wars, and of course he sold it to Disney, and we can all have opinions about that, but there's a guy who had a vision and he followed it all the way through, and he stuck to it regardless of what happened along the way. There's all these tales, and there's probably thousands of other tales of people who had similar dreams, who could have created most amazing things, who gave up on those dreams and didn't just try one more time. And that to me is a critical piece of advice. If you really truly believe in writing and publishing and storytelling, if that is your true passion, then you will find a way to make it happen. People who believe in you will find a way to support you. I left my full-time employment just recently, and the people in my life that I love the most have found a way to support me while I kind of rebuild my life and rebuild what I'm doing. And it's funny, it doesn't matter how many times you fall, you can pick yourself back up again, because you're always looking towards that next shot, that next vision, that next dream, and that next goal.
So for folks who want to learn more about you, learn more about your books, find out what else you're up to, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, my website, markleslie.ca, has all kinds of pretty pictures and some information about me in the background. If you can't get enough of my voice, I have a Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. And on Twitter, I'm at Mark Leslie, and I do love connecting with publishing peeps. And I have this Book Nerds Daily thing that's posted to my website as well, where I just sort of collect publishing and writing and book lovish sort of news, and that's usually where you can find me, is wandering through either virtual or real life places that have books and beer in them. Usually that's usually
That's a good combination. Well, thank you, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, for some really inspiring words today and for helping us take a glimpse into the future. And again, anybody who wants to learn more, go to markleslie.ca. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you, John.
Today's episode of Disruptor was brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book.
For show notes and videos, go to disruptcast.online. And to start a disruption of your own, visit writingblueprints.com to discover the most innovative and coolest way ever to write a great book. We'll be back next week. Until then, go forth and disrupt.